What is a good list with the most commonly asked questions, non-technical questions in the case of a Facebook interview? And before we dive into the list itself, let me first clarify the purpose of such a list. The purpose of such a list is to help you to further tune up your behavioral interviewing skills. It is by no means targeted as a comprehensive method to prepare for a behavioral interview. So simply put, if you are new to behavioral interviewing, you should really spend some time at first reading about the STAR method, about how do you go about answering behavioral questions, about you preparing your stories, your main highlights in your career. And only then, once you feel comfortable with behavioral interviewing, you should go into these types of lists and eventually further tune up your behavioral interviewing skills. Now, this being said, let's go through these questions in reverse order from the least asked to the most commonly asked of them. Give me an example of a time when you helped drive a proposal to a client. Now, obviously, this question doesn't apply for any role, but it's on the topic of dealing with customers, with clients, so that's why it's a very relevant one. So you should ideally think of a situation where you exhibited this behavior and try to build on that situation in order to answer these questions, ideally with a STAR format and ideally within 1.5 to 2 minutes. Give me an example of a risk that you took. Now, why would someone ask you this question? Well, they ask you such questions because they want to see your ability to take calculated risks. So think of a time when you took a risk, and more importantly, of a time when you took a very calculated risk and explain the situation, explain the pros and cons and why that risk was worthwhile. Tell me about the time when you coached a low performer. Now, again, this is not a question that applies to any type of role, but a role that involves to a certain extent dealing with other people, not necessarily managing, but working with other people. So if you do coach your peers, then I believe it's not such a big deal if you think of such a situation, put in a STAR format and make it a bit more concise on exactly the steps that you took, the journey that you took in order to coach that low performer. Of course, ideally with a happy ending. How do you see yourself contributing to Facebook's bigger mission? So first, it helps here to know what's Facebook's mission. To give people the power to share and make the world more open and connected. But you could also consider Facebook's core values when dealing with this. And this should give you enough insight as to have a good starting point into all this. Tell me about the time when your project took a turn for the worse and you basically spinned off the project and turned it into a successful one. Now, this refers to your ability to deal with difficult situations, and this is oftentimes revealing of one's character and one's ability to deal with ambiguous and challenging projects. So needless to say, think of such a situation, of a particular challenging one, and also important to think exactly what were the steps that you took in order to get out of that situation, to resolve that situation in an efficient manner. Give me an example of a time when you had to pitch an idea to gain someone's commitment. Now, why would someone ask you such a question? Well, they ask you this because they want to see how convincing you are, and ultimately they want to see about your ability to earn someone's trust. So if your role is has the ability to pitch ideas as a core competency, then you should definitely consider some of the best pitches that you made, and remember as much detail when it comes to this to talk about them for a behavioral interview. Give me an example of a task that involved working with someone outside of your team. This refers to your ability to work with external members, that is, to have interpersonal skills, that how easy Can you get along with people that you don't know? And this is oftentimes very revealing of one's personality. Tell me about a project where you had a failure and how did you go about that project? Now, this is the classic failure stories, failure scenarios in a behavioral interview. And the more senior the role, the more important it is that you prepare these negatively framed questions and answers. And ideally for an on-site interview, I would recommend you anywhere between 3 and 5 such negative stories. Tell me about the project at one of your earlier companies. Now, this is what I call a gift question, where this is a unique opportunity for you to showcase some of your greatest successes or some idea that you find as the main differentiator for you as a candidate applying for this specific position. Explain to me your current role. Now, this is not necessarily a behavioral question. Like, you could answer this in many different ways, but the main thing here is to avoid being negative. So something I notice quite often when I roleplay this with someone is that they tend to be negative in how they show their frustration in a way that they are not satisfied with their existing role, so that's why they want to move over. When in fact, explaining what's your current role should be nothing more than playing on your strengths and always showcasing your strengths. Why Facebook? So this is a tricky one, or at least one to which I wouldn't have an immediate answer for. So the best way to go about this would be simply to prepare them in advance and keep in mind your differentiators and ideally where you want to be 5 years from now, and try to embed it or try to put it as a career trajectory. Or this would be one option to frame such answers. But of course, your approach to answering such questions may vary upon the role that you're applying for, and in my opinion, it's always a good idea to prepare it in advance. Tell me about a team project that you worked on. So, needless to say, this should showcase your ability to work, to be a team player, essentially. So, oftentimes people are having a hard time coming up with examples of them being a team player because they're mainly working on very small projects. But still, I would very much argue that you should, in theory, so long as there are 2 people, that means it's a team. So it's everything about how you communicate about that project and how you show your interpersonal skills and how you show your ownership within that team that ultimately makes a great answer in these situations. But teamwork is a very important topic, especially when applying for larger corporations. Tell me about a situation where you had to solve a difficult problem. So this basically should showcase your ability to work with ambiguous and difficult situations. So think of a particular challenging situation that you had to work on, a project, or other types of assignment, depending on your role, depending on the type of work that you do, and try to give a concise answer, an efficient and effective answer of how you managed to get out of that difficult, challenging situation, ultimately have a positive outcome. Tell me about the time when you were new on the job and had to learn the tools of the trade. How did you go about that? Now, to me, this is an easy question, because whenever you're new on the job, you basically go through some training, or it could also happen that you have to quickly ramp up your experience. But I found people that find it quite easy to remember those first days on the job. So try to remember such an event, and ideally try to frame it in a star format, in a specific format, outcome driven, if possible. What's your greatest strength and weakness? Now, the main reason why you want to prepare your strength is not because you're getting asked this very often in a job interview, but because it's essential, and really it's critical that you know what's your strength, and that usually takes a little bit of time to figure out. Similarly, for the weakness, is equally important to know it, also because it's more likely to get this question ad literam like this: tell me about your weakness. And many people get stuck or go with false weaknesses, such as I tend to work too much, So I have other videos on this YouTube channel with dozens of examples of possible weaknesses. Tell me about the time when you took the lead on a very difficult project. This question gets asked in order to see your sense of ownership. Right? Your leadership, but it's more like when you owned the project, and you show that you took on responsibility to get the job done in spite of the difficulties, or maybe in spite of the fact that it wasn't necessarily your job to do something. But the idea is that you want to show someone who's really willing to work in a company's best interest. We all deal with difficult customers from time to time. Tell me about one such instance and how you handled that situation. Now, this question is more likely to get asked for people dealing with end customers, with front-facing customer roles, but still this question applies to many other types of roles, simply because, you know, on one hand, you never want to show, obviously, that you treat a client badly, but on the other hand, Facebook is not necessarily creating consumer products, rather than it's being a social network. So you have to find the fine balance between, you know, being customer obsessed, if I may call it this way, and playing in your company's best interest. So you should find the right balance between these two elements with an example from your previous work experience. Tell me about the time when you came up with a new approach to a problem. Now, this question gets asked because they want to see your ability to simplify things, or ideally invent new solutions to problems, ways to optimize things. So think of you know, some aha moments that you had previously in your career, and I'm sure you'll easily find something that would work out quite nicely in this for this question. Tell me about the time when you had to work with a difficult team member. And if you remember, in the beginning of this video, I also talked about dealing with members of your team or from another team, but this question is on that same topic of working in teams, and even more importantly, when you're working with a difficult team member, you must earn their trust. This is something like Inspire. Of course, you should communicate coherently and have regular meetings with them, but ultimately, unless you gain their trust, there's not much chance that you would be able to have an efficient working relationship with that person. Tell me about the time when you were not able to meet a time commitment and what prevented you from meeting it. So this is another failure story that's very commonly asked in Facebook interviews. And as with any failure story, you must think of a proper one. And I basically have many videos on my YouTube channel where I give you insight on how to properly structure these failure stories and how to even to brainstorm for such failure stories. But the main idea here is that you want to have between 3 and 5 such failure stories, especially for an on-site interview. Let's say you're working on a major project and you're in the weeds. How do you find your way out? So this should be revealing of your ability to work with ambiguous situations. You're in the weeds, right? You don't know how to get out. You must make a careful balancing act. You must take some risk there. Now, how do you go about that? I'm sure you've previously dealt with such situations, but the important point here is also how you communicate that situation in such a way that it shows as a calculated risk, that you showed as a leader, as a true leader, and as an efficient decision maker that ultimately gets the job done. So I found on one hand the challenge here is to find the proper stories, and then how you communicate it as well. Give me an example of a time when you faced a conflict while working in a team, and how did you handle that conflict? So I made this question as one of the most commonly asked in Facebook interviews, simply because of interpersonal relationships, interpersonal skills being a core element in so many interviews here. And okay, how do you deal with conflict? Well, first of all, you ensure that you listen to whatever the other party has to say, and then ideally you would want to work with them, meet with them a couple of times, and try to diffuse the situation, try to regain their trust. But there are so many ramifications of conflicts while working in teams, and it's so easy for you to become negative, to say, hey, the other guy was at fault, it wasn't really my fault here, which would be a deadly mistake in a case of a job interview. So I would very much encourage you to think of these challenging situations in a team context and try to come up with precise examples of these. So I will end on the same note as I started this video, that these lists are particularly efficient once you became comfortable answering behavioral questions for a job interview. And I really do believe that it's for telephone screening rounds, you don't have maybe weeks to prepare for them, so that's why you could also use this list as an accelerator in this case. But for on-site interviews, I would stress once more that you would want to prepare on specific core behaviors at first, and to really prepare your stories, your main experiences that you had, to write them down somewhere, index them in an easy to remember format, and only then start practicing with these types of behavioral questions.